Well, hello. I'm Phil Lord from the McGill Faculty of Law, and the paper I'm going to present is Scientology's Legal System. This is a paper that I wrote quite a while ago. Of course, as we all know, the conference in 2020 was canceled, so there's been a lot of work that's been done since, but I like to think that that was the first paper that really took a legal view, a strictly legal view at Scientology and the legal system that's set out in Scientology scripture, and that's applied in the Scientology religion. And I have decided not to prepare a PowerPoint. Instead, I'm welcoming you here, which is my online classroom where I also teach my intellectual property students. So what we'll do, if you'll indulge me, is first we'll go through the paper. If you have it with you, that's great. If you don't, you can either go to either of these links or Google me. I'm sure you'll eventually manage to find me in some way. And so first we'll go over the paper, over the issues that we cover, because the paper is essentially descriptive. So the paper essentially looks at what the legal system is within the Scientology religion, how the various aspects of it are similar to what we'd find in a more traditional secular legal system. And then we'll look at kind of broader issues that arise both in the paper and that in further research have been or will be kind of expanded upon is issues that arise from the very nature and the particularities of the legal system that we have in the Scientology religion that is non-secular, and that's somewhat different from other non-secular legal systems. And throughout the presentation, we'll use this nomenclature actually, right? So what I call the mainstream or secular legal system is the legal system of the states within which Scientology exists, right? The United States, Canada, whatever country it is. Scientology's legal system is its own internal legal system. It's like many religions, right? Scientology has internal rules, and that's something that religions are allowed to have. Internal rules that are applied in one way or another. It's not atypical, right? It's not atypical for religions to have internal rules that they apply to their member, right? Not just rules about how the religion manages itself, but rules that they force their members to respect in one way or another. As we'll see though, generally the consequence of that is limited and different from what we have in the mainstream secular legal system. So in the mainstream secular legal systems, right, there's basically two types of punishments. First type of punishment is you go to jail. If you commit a criminal act, right, we put you in a cage, that's the punishment. Generally, everything else is covered by money, right? Whatever you do in a developed country, right, the only thing that the legal system can do is compensate you with money, right? Regardless of how awful something someone did to you is, right? Whether it's damages for sexual assault, damages for personal injury, having your legs torn off, damages for defamation, right? You don't get legs or your reputation back. What you get is money, right? So the legal system operates on this, and it tends to work pretty well, right? It tends to be a pretty good deterrent. People don't want their money or their freedom taken away. And generally, it's a good deterrent to people not doing things that are wrong in the first place. Of course, right, a religion as a private actor doesn't have a right to do that, right? We'll see in some limited way it might, right? But generally, it doesn't, right? A religion has no legitimacy, no legal basis, if it exists in a developed countries, from taking your money from you or putting you in a cage, right? As a private actor, it doesn't have that right in any way, right? And that's similar to you not having that right, right? You can't have a private prison and you can't take someone's money. You don't have a right to do that. And in fact, there are specific provisions that prevent that, right? Even if you have a willful prisoner, you still cannot have a private prison and imprison that person privately. And so religions have to have some other mechanism to apply these rules that I'm talking about. And that mechanism is generally excommunication. They kick you out of the religion. And that tends to be a pretty strong mechanism to enforce compliance with the rules of the religion, right? It seems like losing your religion is not a big deal compared to losing your money or your freedom, but in actuality, and especially in high control groups, right, which we're all interested in, that can have a very significant impact, right? Losing religious membership generally means losing your eternity, and generally has an impact that is very deep and fundamental in such a way that it might exert compliance with the religion's internal rules in a way that's similar to or stronger than the way that the mainstream secular legal system would induce compliance. So the further step in Scientology, right, there's what we call disconnection, essentially shunning. Right? So when you leave the religion, and Scientology spokespeople would be very careful to frame this as, and you speak out or do something that's evil against the church, well then there is institutionally enforced disconnection, right? So the church is going to tell your family members that are still in Scientology to stop talking to you. If they don't do that, there will be a consequence. Generally, they themselves will be kicked out of the church and will lose all the people that they love, right? That is also, right, indirectly, but quite significantly, a consequence of losing your religion, right? So I said that the way that we enforce the internal rules of a religion as opposed to a mainstream secular legal system is by kicking people out of the religion. I said it induces compliance, right? Well, it induces compliance even more in the case of religions like Scientology, where losing your religion also means losing people who are dear to you. So Scientology has prima facie, as a result of that and other policies, right? Well, see, there's another policy called the fair game policy, which some people say doesn't exist, but does seem to exist if you look at the internet for 2 minutes, right? That says basically, if you attack the church will attack you back to shut you up. And various other policies that make it so that there's a very strong, Scientology is an even stronger way to make sure that people comply with its internal rules. As we'll see, however, Scientology has a legal system that's different from other religions. And we'll look at that both internally and externally. So internally, Scientology has a system that's far more complex, right? Anyone familiar with Scientology knows that it's tens of thousands of pages, right? People spend their whole lives reading it and never get through it, right? The volume of material that was produced by a single person is basically unmatched in any religion, including, non-modern religions. And so the legal system within the Scientology religion is just as comprehensive, or at least has the objective, right, the ambition of being that comprehensive. And so it seeks to cover everything in a way that's not true in other religions, right? Other religions are happy to control, say, what you do in your bedroom or what you do with 10% of your money. Scientology wants to control everything, and Scientology's legal system has the ambition to be able to, and perhaps to, replace the mainstream secular legal system entirely. On top of that, right, Scientology's legal system is different because it has enforcement mechanisms, right? So not only are there rules, these rules are applied in one way or another. Generally, you're told to do something. If you don't do it, again, you're kicked out of the religion. Scientology also has punishment facilities, as we'll see. So private prisons that I mentioned that are illegal, Scientology has them, right? And a fundamental issue is, I told you private prisons are illegal, that remains true. But of course, right, if it's 2 people who do something illegal and no one knows about it, or more importantly, if the victim's not willing to complain about it, right, even though it's illegal, that's not going to have much meaning because no one's going to apply the law to that specific relationship. So now we'll look at the paper in some more detail. The first thing about Scientology and the law is that it hasn't been studied very much. And that's true in a way that's different from other religions which are just as modern as Scientology. For instance, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, or the Jehovah's Witnesses are relatively modern religions that have attracted far more scholarly attention. Scientology hasn't, right? So prima facie, that's kind of weird. It's weird not to see that Scientology hasn't attracted as much as scholarly attention as, say, Christianism, right, which was created thousands of years before. It's surprising that similarly modern religions did attract such attention. And my thesis at the very beginning of the article is to say that this is actually rooted in the very topic of it, which is Scientology's legal system. And in fact, as I said, Scientology has a rule that's called the fair game law, right? And some people will argue it was canceled. Actually, the language of it is, right, the fair game law is canceled because it creates bad PR, right? Because we look bad when we're attacking people, but the essence of it remains unchanged, right? What the fair game law says is, if you attack us, we'll destroy you, essentially, right? If you attack us, we'll attack you back, and we will do anything the heck we want to you. And the specific wording of it says, without any discipline of the Scientologists, right? And again, there's this idea of this overarching legal system within the Scientology religion. We don't care, right, as Scientology, that what you're doing is illegal in the real world, right? What matters is our legal system, which supersedes, right, the mainstream legal system. And in our book, there won't be a consequence for that because it's not illegal. And in fact, right, it was, ostensibly canceled because, or was purportedly canceled because it, quote, created bad PR. Well, why did they keep doing it, right, after that? Because it's what the policy said. And you can see there, preliminarily, the strength of Scientology's legal system, right? The strength of the adherence to it. And the reason people do things that either don't work or that seem to have consequences that don't justify doing it is because it's rooted in rules, right? Scientology is a very regimented, rules-based religion, and the source, right, the religion founder, L. Ron Hubbard, has the same authority as the founder of any other religion, right? Perhaps even more so, and you have to do exactly what it says, even if it doesn't work. So Scientology's kept attacking people because that's what the policy says. That's what the rule within Scientology's legal order says, right? And we can't change that. And in fact, we believe that not respecting it is kind of like a sin. And of course, it might explain why there's been so little scholarly attention. Because Scientology hasn't been afraid to attack people, including scholars, and of course, it's not very usual for scholars to be attacked, right? It's generally not part of their job, especially not when they study religions. And so that might explain why there's been so little scholarly attention. That's had a very significant impact, though. First, there are things that were potentially wrong that no one's looked into, essentially because no one really dared to study it. And that means that there can be things that are wrong or inappropriate that no one looks into because they're afraid to do it, right? Second, what it's meant is that Scientology's had an advantage in that obscurity, right? Because an expert ultimately, and I look at the role of experts in further papers that I've written, especially in the context of getting that status as a religion, but the main specific characteristic of an expert is that they're objective, right? They're a disinterested party, and therefore they have, quote unquote, more credibility. Because they're not getting paid by Scientology or by someone suing Scientology, they're independent, right? They have an opinion that's untainted by some external interest. Well, when there aren't such experts, right, Scientology has far more leeway to try to define what it is that its rules are, regardless of whether that's true or not. So when it gets sued, when it interacts with the mainstream secular legal systems, it can say things about its internal legal system that are either wrong or somewhat misleading, and we saw that happen in various court cases. So first of all, right, where do these rules come from? Well, there are there are the books that you will find on Scientology's website. There's about 20 of them. They're the basic books and lectures, right? And these are, you know, normal length books, but these are basically throwaway books, right? These are not the hardcore stuff, and they don't really cover anything. What does cover Scientology doctrine are we call the volumes, right? The red volumes and the green volumes, and these are, you know, far more comprehensive books. There's thousands upon thousands of pages. There's two series. One of them covers the admin tech, so basically the technology being a Scientology word for rules or policies, right, that apply internally. So how to manage Scientology as an organization. The other set covers basically the policy letters, basically covers the directions as to how members are to direct their lives. So basically they have all of the rules that are necessary for members and that are really the laws, right? The underlying rules to the legal system. So as I said, right, we have the red volumes, which are the tech, right, the rules, and then we have the green volumes, which are the admin volumes. And the one series has the HCOBs, right, the Hubbard Communications Office Bulletins, and the other ones have the Hubbard Communications Office Policy Letters. The policy letters are the administrative part, as I said. So of course, one of the issues with this is even if we had scholarly attention, these things were extremely comprehensive, right? There was so much material that it was particularly intimidating for anyone to get acquainted with it, and therefore, experts, even though they could, were reluctant to engage with that level of material. So these are the books that generate the rules, right? And so we have basically, I'll describe this as three main pillars of a legal system, right? Which we also find in a mainstream legal system, right? The first one is going to be rules. The second is going to be enforcement. And the third we'll call punishment. And that's the broad structure of how legal systems generally work, right? First, there's a rule, and then you don't respect it. Second, right, we prove that you haven't respected it, basically a court. And third, we punish you, whether, as I said, by taking your money or by, putting you in jail. In the case of a religion, right, generally, as I said, they'll tell you what to do. If you don't do it, they have the power to kick you out of the religion. That's the ultimate punishment. So the rules, as I said, are in the volumes of Scientology, right? So the red volumes, which have the technical bulletins, and the green volumes, which have the management system of the Scientology religion. And the rules are quite similar to what we'd find in a normal legal system, right? They're clear, they're positive, they're authoritative. In other words, right, they're phrased as orders, and they're clear. And then the only step that we have to have later on is to apply the rules to the facts, right? To see if the person, whatever they did, actually infringed upon the rules. How do we do that within Scientology, right? Second pillar, we have an enforcement mechanism. It's called the Committee of Evidence. And we'll be careful here to frame it as that's how it's defined, right? We'll look later on as to the fact that maybe it's not actually applied in that way, but that's at least how it's defined in Scientology scripture, right? So you have the local org, right? So the local Church of Scientology is just your normal Church of Scientology, not the big ones that we see on television in Florida and Los Angeles. Just any Church of Scientology in any minor city has its own L. Ron Hubbard communicator, LRH communicator, and that person convenes the Committee of Evidence, which has a chairman, the secretary, and 2 to 5 members, whose rank within Scientology are higher than the accused. And then, right, within what they say is 2 weeks, which is, at least on paper, much faster than the regular legal system, right, it's presented the evidence, and then it renders a decision by majority vote. So they decide whether you're guilty or not on what they're accusing you, right? They use the word guilty even when it's not a crime, quote unquote. And then they issue their decision. What happens if you're not happy with the decision? Basically, the mechanism is you get a second one, right? So you can petition to have another committee of evidence, and for that committee of evidence to make a further decision. Another thing that can happen is you can petition to have the decision canceled without having a second committee of evidence. It's all pretty standard, right? That's all stuff that we find in other religions, right? Stuff where we have rules, and these rules are applied. And ultimately, right, when people are found to have infringed upon the rules, generally they do what they're told because they don't want to be excommunicated. The distinctive feature within Scientology has been that Scientology has the third part, which we don't typically find in religions. And that is punishment facilities, which we would find in the mainstream legal system, right? Prisons or fines or ways for people to take your money as punishment for having done something wrong. Usually, as I said, the way that we exert compliance within religious organizations is by threat of excommunication. And as I said, that's a pretty strong threat, and therefore people generally comply. And so you might tell them to do something, right? Either pay the organization, pay someone, make an apology, right? Whatever it is. And then they might do that because they're afraid that they'll be excommunicated. Scientology also has correctional facilities. So Scientology is going to do what I've just said, like any other religious organization would do. It's going to tell you what to do, and then if you don't do it, right, they'll threaten to excommunicate you. As I said, in the specific context of Scientology, that threat is even stronger because that means that you'll lose all your loved ones. But Scientology also has punishment facilities, especially for members of the Sea Org, which are Scientology's higher ranking management, right? Some call it similar to a clergy, basically the people who work for free, full-time, or housed or fed, right? And these people manage the organization, unlike what they call public, which are regular members. And for them, there is, or was, we'll detail that later on, a punishment facility. Basically a prison, right? It was called The Hole. You can Google it. There's been so many overlapping and consistent accounts that I don't think anyone outside Scientology still denies that the Hole ever existed, right? And basically the executives were put in what is essentially a prison, right? They were put there, there were bars on the door, right? They were cold water poured over them, which has a historical antecedent in Scientology. Scientology's senior order at first being on a ship with Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard, and people being fed basically scraps of trash and being humiliated and having to confess stuff many times, which in Scientology confessionals has a different meaning than it would in other religion, right? And so the E-meter, which is a Scientology apparatus that they use in auditing, which is Scientology counseling, that word shouldn't be used in that context, but it's what people call it, right? The E-meter also has another function, which is essentially to interrogate people, right? But that doesn't mean that they'll confess the stuff that they've done as they would to, say, a Catholic priest. Generally, it means that they'll come up with stuff that they've never done to make the interrogator happy, right? And so there's this culture within the Hole of people, confessing to things that are, lurid and nonsensical stuff that they've never done. And however you call it, right, this has a physical component to it that we don't find in other religions, right? So you might debate whether these people were actually imprisoned. right? And you could argue that they were not, right? You could say there's bars on the door, but there would be a way to leave. And of course, you know, the reason that people don't leave is this underlying threat that I've discussed of being excommunicated, which has a very strong meaning. You'd think especially for people in the Sea organization who are the higher ranking members of the organization, and so who care deeply about their spiritual future and can't afford to be kicked out of the religion. Regardless though, right, there's a physical punishment to it that we don't find in other religions. There's a physical aspect to the punishment, regardless of whether people do it voluntarily or not, that we just don't find in other religions, and that sets Scientology's legal system apart. And, more importantly, it's something that's actually illegal, right, in developed countries, including the United States. Having a private prison, even if people are there voluntarily, is just not legal. So now that we've kind of set out the broad threads of the paper, we'll look at some issues that arise out of that, right? That's a very broad description of Scientology's legal system. And I will look at, you know, some broader issues that arise, and that arise both out of the paper and from further research. So first we'll look at what we'll call the interaction, right, between the legal systems. And I think there's an important distinction here to be drawn, right? So Scientology has, as I said, its own internal legal system, and it's convinced that that legal system is comprehensive and all-encompassing. It doesn't mean that Scientology is ignoring the mainstream legal system. And in fact, right, Scientology's ambition to be all-encompassing, Scientology's ambition to have a legal system that completely supersedes the mainstream legal system is not just paranoia, right? The law does allow religions to have a certain level of autonomy. And that's by virtue of both constitutional protections and the taxation system. So to make things simple, there are basically two statuses with two sets of consequences that you can have as a religion. The first is a constitutional status, right? Even if you're a bad religion, right? Even if you're a religion that people don't like or don't think is legitimate, you're protected under the Constitution in most developed countries. And what that does really is it creates this bubble around you where people cannot intervene. It creates this bubble, right, where even though what you're doing is not consistent with the mainstream legal system, the state will not intervene. And what that essentially means, right, is that you can have people who act in a way that is inconsistent with the mainstream legal system. People who break laws. And we can have religious organizations who make these laws. And even though that's not legal, by virtue of the fact that there's this bubble around them that prevents the state from intervening, right, essentially they're allowed to do it. And so another way to see it is to say that they have limited autonomy, right, from the mainstream legal system. They have autonomy to set out their own legal order, their own rules, their own enforcement mechanisms, right? And they can even force people to act in a way that is not consistent with the laws of the state. Generally, that excludes the criminal laws, right? Like the example I gave you. But it still allows people to act in a way that's inconsistent with the laws of the state. And that's by virtue of the constitutional status. The other thing is a taxation status, right? So basically what that means is that religions won't pay taxes, right? And members will be able to deduct their donations from their taxable income. And that can have an impact on both, of course, incentivizing donations, because then it's much cheaper for the member to make that donation, and a further impact on the organization, because not only does the religion get more money, once it has that money, it doesn't pay any taxes. Generally, that includes all sorts of taxes, right? So investment taxes, whether they're capital gain or investment income taxes, income taxes, so taxes on the money that they get, and property taxes on, say, buildings. It's a different status with a higher threshold. What you have to prove is more than you'd have to prove to get constitutional protection as a religion, and in most systems, including the United States, it's not automatic. All right, so the agency in the United States is the Internal Revenue Agency. It's kind of odd to have tax people being experts of religious status, but that's how it is, right? These people have to give you that status. You don't have it by virtue of you being a religion like you do constitutional protections. And so the recent discussion, we won't get into that, right? But the recent discussion of Scientology losing its tax-exempt status is actually somewhat legitimate, right? It's not incorrect to state that Scientology could lose its tax-exempt status because it's a privilege. It's not something that they're entitled to under the law, and in fact, it doesn't come with the constitutional protections that religions get. So all this, right, creates autonomy. All this lets the religious organization act however it wants, even when that's inconsistent with the state. And so that helps the religious organization like Scientology develop its own legal system because it's allowed the autonomy to do that. Then, right, there's still going to be, in the case of Scientology, an interaction with the mainstream legal system. The first interaction, of course, is that this autonomy I've just said, right, comes from the mainstream legal system. And so the autonomy that Scientology has to make its own rules and apply its own rules, right, that authority is given to it by the mainstream legal system, the secular legal system. And therefore, right, it's all predicated upon Scientology or any religion accepting the legitimacy of that legal system, right? Putting itself under it and saying this mainstream legal system is, higher, and it gives us our autonomy, right? Whatever autonomy we have, we derive it from the mainstream legal system. Scientology is still going to use, and it's been notorious for using, the mainstream legal system. But I want to be careful here. That doesn't mean that Scientology is saying that their legal system is incomplete. In fact, it's saying the opposite. It's not saying that it needs the legal system, the regular legal system, to supplement its own rules. It doesn't, right? Its legal system has the ambition, as I said, to cover everything. Instead, it's purely opportunistic. And so whatever interactions do exist between Scientology and the regular mainstream legal system are only, I think, strategical. So Scientology is using the court system, say, to attack its enemies, right? Or to intimidate people with lawsuits. It doesn't mean that it is recognizing the legitimacy of the mainstream legal system. It doesn't mean that it needs the mainstream legal system. The only thing it means is that it's a tool that they can use. Even if they think that they're autonomous, right, they have this nice weapon that they can use, and I think it's the extent to which they use the legal system. So we have to be careful in drawing this distinction between what Scientology does internally and what it does in interacting with the mainstream legal system. And I want to push this further in two ways, right? So the first one that we'll look at is religious arbitration. And this is something that I've been particularly interested in. So Scientology, right, this is all nice. Right? What I've said so far is all nice because it gives Scientology, at least a limited level of autonomy to do whatever it wants. Scientology's been wise again, not just in having punishment facilities that are not found in other religions, right? And as I said, as I alluded to earlier, right, the whole might not exist anymore essentially for public relations purposes, right? Because everyone talks about that prison and now it's bad for the religion, so they might have gotten rid of it, right? But I don't think the underlying idea of punishing senior members has gone away. And similarly, right, I don't think it changes the way in which Scientology is distinctive from the mainstream legal system. Another way Scientology is trying to kind of push this autonomy further. try to do things that other religions don't necessarily do is with arbitration. Arbitration is a broader mechanism that all sorts of people can use to basically subtract themselves from the mainstream legal system. Arbitration is essentially you and I agree that our dispute will not go to court. And we have to mutually agree on that because we have this higher right to go to court. We both have it. And so we have to both agree to renounce to that right before we can get some other person applying perhaps different sets of rules than the laws, again, that doesn't include the criminal laws, right, to our dispute. Well, right, another consenting party to an arbitration agreement can be a religious organization. So Scientology has been very wise in saying, right, whatever else that we don't get you on. And generally that means, right, when things go wrong. As I said, the main punishment, right, the main threat is to excommunicate. Once you don't believe and you want to leave, then it doesn't work anymore. And so you might have these rules and these enforcement mechanisms, but you can't force people to comply with these rules essentially because they don't believe anymore, and so your main consequence isn't really worth anything anymore to them. And Scientology's responded to that by using arbitration. By saying, well, we'll get our members to sign a contract, and we won't get into whether the contract is valid. Of course, when everyone entering a church is forced to sign a contract, might not be voluntary, which is a requirement under arbitration. But for our purposes, and as the courts have interpreted them so far, they've been found to be voluntary agreements. And so you can have the member of a religion and a religion agreeing to binding arbitration. That's what happened in the Garcia v. Church Scientology case, right? Mr. Garcia tried to get a refund from Scientology. It's actually called a repayment in Scientology. He prepaid for services. So this is not Mr. Garcia paying for stuff, right? Again, in Scientology, you pay for specific prices for specific services on top of other donations. And so it's not Mr. Garcia purchasing a course, right? A higher level course and then being unhappy with it. This is Mr. Garcia who made a prepayment. So he had money on account, as he would in another business, prepaying for services. And eventually he left, and so he did not use these services, and he asked for the money back. That would normally be a repayment because the money isn't Scientology's, because in business terms it hasn't been earned, right? There hasn't been a service provided for it, so it doesn't count as your money under books. But of course, right, Scientology also uses this taxation idea that a donation is a donation, and therefore they still count it as their money, even though there's this distinction. Mr. Garcia asked for his money back. That was covered under the arbitration agreement. I think that was correct, right? At least if we assume the agreement was right. So, had to go to a panel of arbitrators who turned out to be 3 Scientologists, and of course these people are more likely to fight for the church. And as it turns out, it's even worse because within Scientology's rules, right, it says that you're a suppressive person if you fight against the church. These people would have been kicked out of the church and lost their family members if they found for Mr. Garcia. So of course, didn't happen. That's the extent of the voluntary agreement, right? Again, you and I can agree to, if we both agree, right, we can agree to subject our dispute to some non-court actors, and that's allowed, right, as long as it's our mutual interest, and it can be a biased procedure and a biased arbitrator, right? And that's allowed. At least that's how the judge interpreted it. There's further issues that we can discuss as to what is voluntary, what is not, and as to whether the government is condoning religious doctrine, which it's not allowed to do under what we call the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution. But the judge interpreted it in the way that I've just described. Then Mr. Garcia said something else. Mr. Garcia said, you defrauded me. On top of getting that money on account, right, you got me to pay for something by lying to me, right? You told me, give me donations for this, a donation for this, and it was a lie. That's fraud. Generally, that's not covered under the contract, right? The contract says, I'll pay you, you'll pay me, right? That's contractual. Fraud is not contractual. Someone taking your money and there's no contract. And so it's kind of beyond the scope of the contract, right? But the arbitration clause was interpreted broadly to cover the whole relationship. And so Scientology has used this successfully, right? And we saw it happen for sexual assault more recently, which has even more dire consequences, to expand their autonomy. Scientology has used this to expand the scope of the autonomy of their legal system. So they have this autonomy that they're given by virtue of their constitutional status, like any other religion. But Scientology has expanded that by trying to be smart with arbitration agreements that subject a much broader range of disputes to arbitration, so to its internal procedure without recourse to the external mainstream legal system. And it's done that in a way that's mandatory for all members, right? So that covers not just those who agree to it, but essentially everyone, because everyone has to sign that contract. The other distinction that I want to bring, right, is this idea of what is abusive. So there's been a lot of talk lately on on the extent to which we can challenge the taxation status of Scientology. And one of the rules, right, regards organizational behavior. So if we want to have an argument on Scientology, I think we have to be careful as to, right, the doctrine is and what the organization is, right? And that's an argument that gets conflated sometime in a way that is detrimental to the argument that people are actually trying to make. Scientology, right, is allowed to have whatever policies it wants, even if these policies are bad or abusive. And there's examples in Scientologies that are very convincing as to the fact that you probably shouldn't get into Scientology, right? There's various ways that you have to confess your thoughts, right, that make you not think bad thoughts in the first place. There's this kind of 1984-like thought police, right? There's various other abusive policies like attacking enemies that we find only in Scientology, right? And so you might make an argument that Scientology's rules are abusive. Scientology's legal system is illegitimate because it's abusive, right? Unlike the rules in our normal court system, they're intrinsically bad rules that hurt people. That's an argument you can make. That's an argument generally that's constitutionally protected. Because, as I said, there's this fear of autonomy that says we don't look at religious doctrine. In other words, we don't look at religious rules in the way they're applied. And so even if we think they're bad, right, we don't even get there. That's what happened in the Garcia case, right? We don't look at whether it's applied in a biased way or it's an abusive rule or an illegitimate rule because we can't even get into it. It's off limits. What you might say, though, is that Scientology's organizational behavior is abusive, and that's a different story. It's not saying the rules within Scientology are abusive. It's saying Scientology is an abusive organization, not Scientology the doctrine, Scientology the organization. And that is not covered, right? There isn't a protection that says a religion can hurt people. A religion can go after people, can attack experts. There's no rule under the Constitution that says that. So that argument for legal purposes is far more convincing. To say that regardless of the rules, and oftentimes on top of the rules, the organization itself acts in a way that's abusive and that should subtract it from various statuses. More specifically, as I said, to get tax exemption in the United States, right, and in most countries, there's further requirements. You don't get it just by virtue of calling yourself a religion. It has to be, granted to you. And it's a privilege. It's not a right. And therefore, that privilege can be taken away for any reason. And one of the compelling reasons might be, right, that you are an abusive organization, that you hurt people. And that's a reason to take away your tax-exempt status because you're not entitled to it regardless of what you do in the same way as the constitutional protections. And so I think this is a distinction that hasn't really been made in research thus far, and that should be made in further research, right? We should be careful to frame our arguments to say whether we're trying to say that the rules are bad or that the organization is bad. And the distinction is important because the latter is an argument that can lead to consequences, including the revocation, for instance, of religion's tax-exempt status. finally, perhaps we can have a broader look at this, right? Scientology is and has been an organization that has been ambitious. To a large extent, it's failed in what it's tried to do. But it's very much, right, in keeping with the persona of the founder. The founder was someone who believed he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And he thought he was going to change the world. And so it's not surprising that Scientology's legal system encompasses that, embodies this idea that it has to be comprehensive. It has to be the best legal system ever, and it has to be the only thing you need to order your life, right? And that's a reflection of the founder as much as it is a reflection of how legal systems generally work. And in fact, we could push this further by saying, L. Ron Hubbard, for a long part of his life, was on a ship, right? And there's still this tradition of both the Sea Org, right? The word sea refers to that. And the ship still exists to deliver higher level courses within Scientology, right? And essentially at the time he was evading the law, right? Because in international waters you're not really in a country, right? No one has jurisdiction over you, so they can't arrest you. That's pretty convenient if people are trying to go after you for having broken the law. But it's also a reflection of this idea of independence, right? This idea that somewhere at sea there could be this legal system in a state of their own, this legal system that encompasses everything, that's comprehensive, that rules the entire organization or the entirety of Scientology's world, right? And that doesn't require us to resort to anything else because it's freestanding and independent.